My name is Lorelei McCollum. I work at IBM. I've been kind of in the automation, test, build pipeline stuff for almost 10 years now. We moved over to using Jenkins maybe 2 or so years ago. So this talk is Jenkins 101, getting started with Jenkins. Essentially, I've been to the conference in the past, and there was a lot of deep dive really quick, and it kind of wards people off if they're new to this. So this is why I'm doing kind of a 101, get you familiar with Jenkins and what it's all about and how it can, how it works, how to use it, and how it can potentially help you in your products and your businesses. So what we're going to cover today is some brief install, build, designing your Jenkins jobs and your pipelines, parameterization, workspace, the workspace of Jenkins, the Jenkins nodes or the slaves, security around your Jenkins, source control for your jobs, Groovy, and some plugins. So installing Jenkins is pretty easy. There's instructions right on their website. It supports various platforms. We actually use Linux Ubuntu server for our Jenkins master, but it's really easy to do, and so I wanted to throw this slide out there in case anyone here has not installed Jenkins before. It's very easy. So the first thing that I want to talk about with Jenkins is the build. So Jenkins refers to this thing as the build, and what is that? It's not necessarily your product build. It can be anything. It's essentially I consider it the main method of your Java class. It runs what you want to do. So whether it's writing tests, running tests, deploying something, actually building your product, it can be any of those things. So you really have to throw the notion of what you might think a build is out the window when you start using Jenkins, because it can do anything you want. It's an automation tool. So there's 3 main parts to a Jenkins job. There's the pre-build, the build itself, and the post-build. So the pre-build is anything you want to do and set up environment variables, get things squared away before you actually do the main work of the job. It allows you to kind of customize and configure these 3 different steps. The config of a Jenkins job is essentially where you go to say, this is what I want this to do. And there's 3 main steps to each job, and it's really key to understand each section and all the different features and aspects that you can add to those to really customize how you want to create your job. There's tons of plugins out there. There's hundreds of plugins. I think there's maybe thousands of plugins now. So there's probably a plugin that can do what you want to do. So it's use Google and find those plugins for what you're looking to do. So when you're actually in the config of a Jenkins job, there's these little buttons that say add build steps. And based on what's installed on your Jenkins master and what plugins you have set up, you'll see an array of a different list. This is kind of a basic list. We have some extra things installed on our Jenkins master, which may be different than yours. And this kind of, based on what you install, it appends or adds to these build steps. There's post-build. These are examples of post-build plugins that add to the post-build section of the job. And you can do lots of different things. You can see here like publishing and reports and JUnit results and sending emails and doing all sorts of stuff. So it's really powerful. These plugins really make Jenkins powerful because they give you this ability to do whatever you want at each of these 3 steps of the job. So the biggest thing when coming in to write your first Jenkins job or to write a pipeline or some CDCI for your product, you really want to think about design. And the reason why I say this is I jumped into this in a few days and wrote all these jobs and then realized that they all share common things, which now the workflow plugin kind of helps with that. But that didn't exist when I started this. So reconfiguring Jenkins jobs is really painful, especially if you say added a new plugin and now want to add it to every single one of your jobs. To have to go and hit config on every single one and add the change and then hit save, it can take you all day. So you really want to think about what do these Jenkins jobs need to do? How are you going to update them or change them? What are things that are going to change? How are you going to debug these jobs when they fail? So you really want to kind of whiteboard it out or design it on paper before you actually just go and create a bunch of jobs, because you're probably going to end up going back and tweaking them to make the design better. So you really start small and then expand from there. And there's a lot of use naming conventions, things like that. I find on our Jenkins we end up with people creating all these test jobs, and it's like 3 months later you have no idea what those jobs are or what they even do. So you really want to enforce kind of some standards to the people that you allow to create jobs on your Jenkins. Now, out of the box, we'll talk about security and who can do what in your Jenkins environment. But if you give everyone create access, you're going to have like Lorelei's job 1, Lorelei's job 2, and you'll forget what those are for 3 months down the road. So I feel like designing your pipeline, designing these jobs, you really want to step back and look at that before you start to do this. Configuring the jobs, the Jenkins job can pretty much do anything you can do command line. It can automate that for you. It can run it on a schedule. It can run it as triggered from something else. You don't want to hard code things that could potentially change. If you're building your product and you have different releases, and say there's a stream or a branch and that changes from release to release, you don't want that hard coded in your job. You want to pass it as a parameter, pull it from source, make it an environment variable. So these things you really want to think about when you're starting to write your jobs. Security, who can build and configure your Jenkins environment? I mean, you can have admins, you can have advanced users, you can have read-only users, your everyday users. You want to set this up from the beginning, because otherwise to go back in, and we'll see in a few slides, it's tedious. It's like every person's an individual line, and so we use groups to kind of control this, so that you never have to go into the Jenkins master to do your security. You just, in however your company works, you say add this person to this group, and then they automatically get access. The Jenkins Workspace is really useful. For every build that runs, every job that runs in Jenkins, it has its own unique workspace, and that can be really useful. You can put artifacts there, you can put properties files, you can write out logs, you can do all sorts of things with that workspace. It can be leveraged to do more complex workflows and that type of stuff. So think about that when you're writing these jobs. You can create and pass environment variables all around. You can, there's an environment injector plugin that allows you to kind of, if you're creating environment variables, then inject them back in so the rest of the Jenkins job knows what to do or has them accessible. Also, there may be better solutions than actually blocking jobs. So blocking jobs in Jenkins means that this job will wait until it's completed running, so that it will be spinning up and running and running and running until it's done. And what that does is it's taking up an executor, and what an executor is when you run jobs in Jenkins, they run on executors on your slave node or your master, and sometimes you don't want to have a job that's blocking for hours. I mean, what happens if you have to restart Jenkins, or there's a power outage, and then what happens to your job? So there's better solutions than actually using the blocking jobs feature. But there are cases for it, and it can be used. The other thing to note is how to maintain your slaves, your nodes, your jobs, the pipeline. You want to think about things like that. How do you add a new node in, or how do you retire a node? How do you do operating system updates on your nodes without taking down your whole pipeline? So things like that are something to consider. Parameterization. So we do a lot of parameterization in our Jenkins jobs that we have, and essentially it allows you to reuse the job. And that's really key, especially if you have hundreds of jobs. And if you can get them to all go through kind of one downstream job and just send a bunch of different parameters, and it'll do different things based on the parameters, then you only have one place to maintain and update that job, and then everything else will just work. So that's something to think about when you're designing your pipeline or your jobs on the whiteboard. And then also, when you release new products, you branch, you do things like that. You don't want to have full copies of your build pipeline for every single branch that you have. You want to be able to reuse that so that you can pass things through it. And that's where, passing the branch, passing your stream, or however, whatever source control you're using, is really, really key with parameterization. And also, you can do a lot of stuff in parallel too with this, and we use the multi-job plugin to do that, and that allows you to kind of not have so many duplicate jobs, because everything, you could kick off 10 jobs that all go through the same downstream job, and they're just passing different parameters, and you can kind of use the multi-job plugin to do this. So it's pretty cool. How do you get a build with parameters? So when you're in the Jenkins config and you say you want to add parameters to that build, there's a little checkbox. It's kind of hidden. If you haven't been in the config of a Jenkins, it's near the top. You have to check the box, and then you get this ability to add these different parameters. You can add all sorts of parameters, from Booleans to lists. Our favorite is actually the extended choice parameter. And the reason why we like this is the fact that we have a bunch of jobs that all have the same parameter options. So you might have one job that has parameter A, B, and C, and then you have another job that has the same parameters and another one. You don't want to have to hard code them in each one of those jobs. So the extended choice parameter allows you to actually pull parameters from a properties file. And so we have this job params properties file that has all our different parameter options in it. And with that file can also be in source. So essentially you want to make a parameter change, you make a change in source, it builds in Jenkins, then all your jobs get updated with the new parameter. So it's pretty cool and pretty powerful, especially if you find yourself copying the parameters from job to job. So I highly recommend this. And in my other session tomorrow, I'll go in more depth on kind of how to implement pulling parameters from source and kind of doing this type of stuff. So naming conventions, I talked about this. You want to think about your job names, the parameter names, the build names, because when you're looking at this stuff, or managers come in, or your release manager comes in, you want it to be easy for them to understand what's running and what just built, and what's testing right now, and being able to get there quickly. If you have thousands of jobs in your Jenkins environment, you really want to organize things correct. And you can sort by the names of things, but if you're not adopting a standard, then that can get really hard. Also, in parameters, when you write parameters in your jobs, you really want to think about the names of those parameters. What I have found is that spaces can actually make your life harder in those parameters, while it looks pretty for the end user. So if this is like a self-service or an on-demand, the end user runs it kind of job, then it's useful to have spaces so they can read it and understand it. But when you're doing like an automatic pipeline, spaces don't really port well to environment variables, and things like shell and stuff like that don't really like you to have spaces in your environment variables. So there are ways around it. You can use Perl and stuff to get at it, but I found it was a little tough if you use spaces, but it can be done. But it's something to think about, your parameter names, your build names, your job names. The Jenkins Workspace. So we talked about this. Every build that runs has its own unique workspace. You can actually customize the workspace to force two jobs to run out of the same workspace. And this can be useful in certain scenarios, such as these two jobs need access to the same properties file, or this job writes out something that then this job needs to consume and do something with. So there's this little checkbox that allows you to force them to use a custom workspace. But by default, they all get their own unique one, especially if you allow it to do concurrent builds, which out of the box, a Jenkins job that runs doesn't allow another one to run at the same time. It'll queue behind it, but there is a checkbox that you can check to say, allow these things to run concurrently. You've acknowledged that nothing bad's going to happen if you do that, and you've coded it in that scenario, but there's a checkbox that allows you to do that, and when you do the concurrent builds, each one gets a unique workspace. So that can be useful in doing reports and writing emails and things like that with the Jenkins jobs. Jenkins nodes. So the nodes or the slaves are kind of the workhorses of your Jenkins environment. We actually don't run much on our master Jenkins server because we find it could slow down the master, make the web page itself slow, and we don't really want to put load on the Jenkins server itself. So we have probably 70 or 80 slave nodes that we use to actually run all of our stuff. It's easy to create these. You can actually you can create them in a couple different ways, which I will show from Windows or Linux. We find the Linux nodes seem to work a lot better than the Windows ones, but some of my engineers do have a couple Windows nodes for specific requirements. So you can add nodes of all different types, and it's pretty easy to add them. And one of the best practices I'd say is limit how many executors you give your master. Whoever you give create access to create jobs in your Jenkins, they can create jobs wherever they want and have them run wherever they want. And so if you allow them to create jobs and they happen to run them on the master, you could be wondering why your master is really slow or the web page is slow to load, because it's hard to, I guess, keep an eye on this type of stuff or who's doing what, especially as your Jenkins environment grows and you have more and more jobs. It's really hard to, understand what every person that's working on it is doing. So, limiting that gives you that ability to kind of control a little more. The Jenkins API is also really fun. My session tomorrow is on a lot with Groovy, and so you can do a lot with Groovy, especially creating nodes on the fly, creating them dynamically, and adding them to your Jenkins system. Creating the Jenkins nodes is pretty easy. You just go in. There's a creating new dump node option, and you basically give it a name. I recommend having a good naming convention for them. You can say how many jobs you want to run on this at once. Now, if your machine doesn't have much memory or many CPUs, I don't recommend giving it 100 executors. So you'll want to basically think about, this is a process that's running on this server or this machine. What are really the limits to that? It's pretty easy to connect. We use keys, SSH keys, to connect to our Linux slaves. You can choose these options here on how you want to connect to it, whether it's Windows or Linux. And then also there's another key thing about the slave is the usage of it. So how do you want people who are writing Jenkins jobs to use this slave? Do you want it to just throw jobs at it, if there's free resources, or do you want to have this slave be for specific jobs only? So there's kind of two options here. We usually go for the latter because certain slaves serve certain purposes, and some of them are for builds and need things like Maven installed on them, and others are for just running automation and need X, Y, and Z installed. So we tend to go for the second one. So how do you decide which jobs go to what nodes? So we just said you could specify, have a slave node that's only tied to specific jobs. So in the Jenkins config of your job, there's a little checkbox, another checkbox, that says restrict where this Jenkins job can run. Essentially, it takes either a node or a label. And what a label is that you can, when you're creating these Jenkins nodes, you can kind of group them all together and say, these are of this type. So that, when Jenkins is doing its queuing and its spraying of jobs to the nodes that have available executors, it'll just go to that label, see which node has free executors in that label, and just pick one and send the job to it. So Jenkins is really good at kind of queuing and sending the jobs where they need to go, as long as you've configured the pipeline to do that. So in our case, we have a label that's for most of our stuff, and I think we have like 35 slaves in it right now, and Jenkins will just automatically spray the jobs to it, which is really useful. And another thing is to name your labels appropriate, so they're easy to understand when you're writing jobs. Plugins for job node assignments. So essentially, when you're writing this job, this Jenkins job, there's various plugins out there that allow you to say run on this node or run on this label. And so the NodeLabel parameter plugin actually gives you a parameter. So we talked about the parameters for your job. The NodeLabel one gives you the ability to, as a parameter, when it's getting executed, someone's manually running the Jenkins job or the pipeline's triggering it, you can choose the label or choose the node in like a dropdown or pass it as a variable. You also can use the Groovy label assignment plugin. That's if you install that plugin inside your Jenkins job, that gives you another checkbox. So these plugins, when you install them, usually if they are for your job itself, will give you checkboxes or you'll see various things in the Jenkins config to access and use these plugins. So this one, the Groovy one, gives you, you can have like a little snippet of Groovy code that'll say like, if parameter equals true, run on this node. If parameter equals false, run on this node. So in case, based on the input that's coming into the pipeline, where you want to send the job. And that can be really useful as well. So this is what it looks like. So you get a checkbox, and then you can say, well, if we're in dev mode and we're regression testing, send it to my development slaves. But if we're not, then send it to the production slaves. So it can really give you the ability to, with one set of pipeline jobs, test it in, maybe you're making changes and it's like a development scenario, or it's a real production scenario. So it allows you to reuse the same pipeline, but kind of parameterize it. This is the other one that I talked about, the NodeLabel one. It gives you a parameter that's essentially the node, and you can kind of customize it so that it only allows for certain ones to be selected, and that can be passed in, whether it's someone running the job manually or if it's the pipeline triggering it. And this is what the label, so there's the node parameter and there's a label parameter, and you can specify what the label can be. So moving on to the security of Jenkins. So essentially, you have your Jenkins environment, and you really want to think about who has access to it. We adopted kind of some groups, read, development, and admin, because we don't want our basic end user to have the ability to create jobs, delete jobs, build all our jobs. So we have kind of separated out in this scenario. And then at an individual job level, you can actually say, well, this person can have build and config access to this job. So you can kind of, at a global level, set it kind of very high level, and then at specific jobs, you can kind of configure it based on the needs of that project. This is what it looks like if you use the matrix authorization plugin. And as you can see, if you were to list your end users individually, this is a huge list of checkboxes that just goes forever. And if you had 100 people that have access to your Jenkins server, maintaining a list of 100 with all these checkboxes gets really hard really fast. And so it's much easier to go the route of groups. And then this is at the project specific, where you can enable the specific Jenkins job and give one of your engineers full access to it, because he's going to own this job and he's going to config it and build it. Then you can do it at a job level, but that doesn't give the engineer full access to your full Jenkins server. So it's really useful to operate like this. Source control for your jobs. So your job, you may have some shell scripts that you run, you may have Groovy scripts, you may have properties files, parameter files, all sorts of stuff that's in your Jenkins job, and it may be reused from job to job. And so what we do is we actually have a kind of a source control repository for all that stuff. Now that stuff as a whole doesn't, they're just individual scripts. And what we do is we have, that's in source control, and we have a Jenkins job that actually builds that. And then what that Jenkins job does is it's just a dummy build of copying the artifacts from source, and then it archives them. So now they're in this Jenkins job, archived as artifacts. So then other jobs can actually come in and copy artifacts, specific artifacts that they need to run from that job. So it gives you kind of the ability to have your scripts and really the workhorses of your Jenkins jobs in source, but pull them from source every time. And this is how you would essentially set up that job to build that source repository. We're using RTC in this case, which is an IBM source control. And you essentially just build it, and then you archive. You archive all the files. And so that gives any other job in your Jenkins environment the ability to copy artifacts from this job and use them. So if you make changes in source, then all the jobs will essentially get them as soon as it builds. And this is this example of the build step that would copy artifacts from that job and copy the specific artifacts that it needs to run or execute. Like you can see here, I'm executing some shell script, and when you do this copy artifacts, it actually takes those artifacts and puts them in your workspace, that workspace which is unique to that job, and then you can access them as a path to the workspace. Kind of like that. If you flatten directories, that checkbox there, it won't take the folder structure. It'll just throw every file at the root of the workspace, and you can choose to access them as that way as well. So pulling job parameter options from source. So this is what I talked about, where if you have a bunch of parameters that you want to pull from source with the extended choice parameter plugin, this job params.properties, if you look at the full path there, it's actually pulling it from that admin update pipeline config job. So that properties file is actually in source in our repository. It gets built by the admin update pipeline config when there's changes, and then every job, essentially, if it's pulling at that path, can then have those new parameters. So it's really quick to get them. You can also pull things like Groovy scripts directly from source. The Groovy is a plugin. If you add it, there's a couple plugins for it. You can add it to your Jenkins environment, and you can do things like if you copy those artifacts from that Jenkins pipeline config job, you can reference them. So you can do $workspace, and as long as it's been copied down to the workspace, it'll just execute it for you. And then in like the Postbuild, there's a Postbuild Groovy plugin, which while the job, it's kind of confusing. It's in your job, and your job is running on your slave or node that you specify. But the Groovy Postbuild plugin, when it's actually executing, it's executing on the master. So essentially to pull those files from source, you have to list the full path to that admin update pipeline config job to pull those, but they're pulled from source as well, so it's pretty useful. So Groovy. So I'll go into more depth in my session tomorrow on Groovy, but essentially it gives you the ability to kind of either write some Groovy scripts, which is kind of like Java, or it understands Java. It's kind of like, I call it the shorthand version. Or you can have these things, it's called system Groovy scripts. And those actually run in the JVM space of Jenkins, which can be pretty powerful and can be really bad at the same time if you don't know what you're doing. Because a system.exit in a system Groovy script will actually take your Jenkins master down. So I had one engineer try that out and then wondered, why did Jenkins go down? Well, you exited the JVM. So it was pretty funny. But it can be pretty powerful because you can access the APIs of Jenkins, and you can get artifacts. You can copy artifacts. You can do all sorts of stuff with system Groovy scripts. So I have some useful Groovy snippets, such as you can find how many jobs are running on different slaves, and get things like, is this slave online? So you can do a lot of stuff with this. You can restart nodes, and I will go into this in more depth as well in my next presentation. So you can create reports and links to your jobs. So using the Groovy Postbuild and the Groovy system scripts, you can kind of customize your build. So after the job is done running, you get kind of a build page, which is the output, what happened, what passed, what failed, what tests ran. You can kind of customize it and create quick links and reports with this stuff. So the Groovy Postbuild plugin gives you this kind of ability to access the test results and log little HTML links to websites and things like that. So it really gives you this power to customize. So this is you can do Groovy quick links with Groovy system scripts as well as the Groovy Postbuild plugin. So there's always a couple different ways to do whatever you want with Jenkins. It's just finding the way that's best for you. And these quick links, you can kind of do it with a system Groovy script or the Groovy Postbuild plugin. Either one is an option, and this is how you would kind of add that to the job. And this would be in a Groovy script that you execute as part of the build. And so, come to my session tomorrow to kind of go in more depth in that. So various plugins. So I'm going to go over quickly some plugins that are useful to me that I have used and found them, very good for our pipeline. So the build timeout plugin. So if you want to abort a job after a certain amount of time, what that means is that Jenkins just stops it from running. This is especially good if you have runaway jobs that for some reason there's something wrong with them and they never terminate. This will ensure that they get properly aborted after a given period of time. The environment injector plugin. Essentially, this allows you to inject environment variables that maybe you set up or set as part of the build. So you're running along in your build and you set some variables, but now you want the next steps in the build to have those variables. This environment inject variable step will get you that. The build name setter plugin. This is my manager's favorite because it essentially takes your build history in Jenkins for a given job. So by default, the Jenkins build history just shows the build number, so the pound build number. This plugin allows you to customize what that shows based on your parameters or environment variables. So this is really cool, especially if you have different builds or different configurations or different parameters going through a job. It gives you a quick one-stop. You actually understand what just ran without having to click or dive in. The multi-job plugin allows for you to run a lot of stuff in parallel all at once. It kind of gives you this ability to have different phases in your Jenkins job. So essentially you could have phase 1 runs 10 things in parallel, and then phase 2 doesn't start until phase 1 is done, and then phase 2 would say run 5 things in parallel, and then you could have phase 3 and go on and on. But it gives you a nice, I guess, look to what's running in parallel. So this is a plugin you have to install. It actually, when you're creating your Jenkins job, it's a different job type that you have to select to get this ability. So it's a multi-job project, but it's been really useful for us. The nested view plugin, this helps organize the views in your Jenkins system. Essentially, if out of the box, they all just kind of show up in the main page. And if you have lots of teams working in there and you have tons of jobs, this gives you the ability to kind of organize them for each team or component so that the other teams don't see the other people's jobs that they don't really care about. So the nested view plugin kind of gives you this ability to have these nested views, and once you click into them, it's just your view, and you can have many tabs and folders for that. So it's really useful. We use this a lot since we have many products in our Jenkins system. The email extension plugin I love this plugin, it's great. It allows you to send email reports after your jobs are done. It allows you to customize those email reports based on variables, parameters. You can set the HTML for however you want it to look. And you can also, you can have different triggers on who it goes to. You can use environment variables. It gives you, this is an example of what it looks like in the post-build action. You can set up your email, you set the subject. You can also use the advanced section and throw a Groovy script in there. And so you can say, run this code to format this email and create it. And we do something like we add in all the tests that ran as part of that build, and then we format the subject to be something like, because everyone's using mobile these days and you want a very concise subject. So based on if the test all passed or failed, you can say failed and the build number and then the environment, and then it's like 3 lines. People understand exactly what happened or if they need to debug. So this is pretty powerful with the advanced section. So these are just the useful plugins that I've kind of talked a little bit about or that we've used that help us with our CDCI pipeline. There's a couple of them we went over, but these are all really good plugins that if you haven't tried them, I would recommend looking them up and trying them out. Also, if you're stuck or you need help, I've found that Google is your best friend. Stack Overflow has lots of stuff. And half the time I've Googled something and someone else has tried to do it as well. So it's really useful to go out there. The Jenkins book, if you're just getting started, by O'Reilly is really good too, to read that. There's tons of forums and communities. And I think most of the questions people have had them. And there's tons of plugins out there. I've reported a lot of bugs. They're pretty good about fixing them and looking at them. So be active in the community. Please share your feedback. Thanks, everyone.